Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on the Battle of Gettysburg. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Gresh Lattimore. Gresh Lattimore became interested in naval service as a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Inspired by some naval officer classmates, he enrolled in officer candidate school at Newport, Rhode Island, and he received his commission in 1966. He served 2 tours of combat duty aboard the USS Coral Sea off the coast of Vietnam. He served another tour as a faculty member at West Point. After active service, Gresh returned to the Fletcher School to earn a PhD. He joined the Naval Reserve as an intelligence officer, retiring in 1990 aboard the USS Constitution after 23 years of service at the rank of captain. One of the joys of his life is his work as president of the Advocates for Tufts, ROTC, an alumni support group for Tufts University's ROTC students. He's a member of the executive committee of the Lexington Veterans Association and the Town Celebrations Committee. After retiring from a career in banking, Gresh is pursuing his lifelong interest in military history. Please welcome Gresh Lattimore.
Sorry, you can start talking at least.
Okay. Good afternoon, both you in the audience here. It's so good to see, and you in virtual Zoom land. And I welcome you to a discussion of the Battle of Gettysburg. This is not going to be your typical talk, because I'm not wanting to just go through the battle itself, although that's the framework for the talk. But what I'd like to bring out is, we always think of General Lee when you think of General Lee, the Confederate general, who had bested the Union armies for the first couple years of the Civil War. And here again was another opportunity for him to win again. And this is what we're
Sorry.
what we'll be talking about today, because he will finally meet his medal in George Meade. Yeah, present. Yeah, forward. That should do it.
Okay. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
No, that's good. Okay. So the Battle of Gettysburg, it's 1863. We're a couple years into the war. None of the Union generals seem able to win a battle. The Confederate armies everywhere seem to be on the offensive, and they're doing well. So how does George Meade in this photo come to prominence? Interestingly enough, the author of this book, Meade at Gettysburg, and I'm talking now about Kent Brown, wrote a book in 2005 about the retreat from Gettysburg. This is like a biblical thickness book with so much detail you just blur. But he certainly knew a lot about the Battle of Gettysburg. And just last year, he came out with this new study of Meade in command. Now, the reason we don't know much about Meade is that Abraham Lincoln thought that Meade, having won the Battle of Gettysburg, would annihilate Lee's retreating army and the Civil War would be over. but it didn't happen. And we'll talk about that today. So in Lincoln's eyes, it wasn't the way he wanted Meade to act after he had bested Lee. He wanted him to continue the offensive, to wipe him out, to bring the war to a conclusion. And so since he was unable to do that, he's sort of fallen into obscurity. Now, he wasn't fired by Lincoln. He remained as the commander in charge of the Army of the Potomac. There were many other Union armies, but Grant comes to the fore at about this time, because don't forget, when Gettysburg falls, or we win, the Union wins on July 3rd, 1863. The next day, Vicksburg, way down south in Mississippi, falls to the Union Army of Ulysses S. Grant. So, and Grant is just a more appealing person, but we'll talk about that. It was very interesting to me, and I don't know how many people know this, but General Henry Halleck was in charge of the Union armies, and he had brought forth a bunch of West Point grads to lead the Union armies to no avail. And the most recent one was General Joe Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker, a West Point graduate of 1837, and he was in charge, but he had just been bested by Lee at some recent battles. And on top of that, he hated Lincoln. He would not deal with Lincoln. And so, if you're the president of the United States and one of your major generals is not speaking with you and won't talk with you, you've got to replace him. And so that's the situation. Hooker hadn't won a battle, and he couldn't liaise well with Lincoln in Washington. Halleck and Lincoln offered John Reynolds, a graduate of West Point in 1841, the command of this Army of the Potomac. Reynolds, who was one of the most highly respected Union generals, turned them down. Why? He felt it would not be career enhancing to be in charge. So the president offers you a command and you say, well, I don't think so. I might not go any further. So John turns it down. So Halleck and Lincoln are now at a quandary. What do we do? What do? They don't ask. They order George Meade, another West Point grad, to take the command of the Army of the Potomac. Now, and they do this because they're in Washington. Meade is with the Army. He's not in charge of it at this point, but he's in the Army with in the area with his troops. He is wakened in his tent at about 7 o'clock on the 28th of June, 1863, and told, you're now in charge. And you're replacing Joe Hooker. And initially, Meade felt or thought that he was being arrested. He wasn't sure for what, but something might have happened that he was no longer in favor, but not so. Now, this is not a situation where he goes over, General Meade goes over to General Hooker and says, well, should we sit down and talk about what's happening? Because I'm now in command. Not at all. Hooker was moving his armies, and maybe his armies, these are the blue armies or the Union armies. Don't get mesmerized by the towns and so forth. Just realize that Lee was on a forage invasion of the North. Remember, most of the battles up until this point were in Virginia. So Virginia farmland is devastated, and all these Yankee farms are overwhelmed with provisions, wheat, corn, maybe some clothing in the stores in the North and so forth. So his original intention of going to, of coming north was not to encounter the Union Army per se. He was just coming on a forage movement. But very shortly, the Union saw that the Confederate armies were moving north. And so something must be happening. You know, if Lee is moving his armies north, we ought to do so as well. And so they did. And what initially happens here is the Confederates have no opposition as they march through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, because the Union Army isn't there. And of course, you know, Maryland is iffy whether it was it did not succeed, but I think Lincoln had jailed all the legislature so that they would be unable to pass a bill like that. There was a lot of Southern empathy and in Maryland. So Lee is moving north, a lot of troops there, but with no particular action in mind. The Union armies, as I've said, know this. They're moving north too, but they're unable to get an idea of what's actually going to happen. But things are in motion. And Meade now, the 28th, so from the 28th of June to the 1st of July is all the time that Meade has to gather his armies into a coherent group and to find out what Lee's about. So now, Meade knows most of his subordinates, his corps commanders, because they all went to West Point, right? You'll see this again and again. And when we start talking about the Confederate officers, they all went to West Point. So these guys all know each other. And Lee is supposed to have remarked upon hearing that Meade was appointed head of the Union armies. He will not let me off easily if I make a mistake. So he felt that Meade was a good opponent, and he was going to be careful for that. So now the armies are moving north. And what we're going to talk about is a 3-day battle. Day one, just to give you an overview, and maybe you know this, but day one is where the armies converge. Okay, they finally bump into each other. That's day one. And the Union emerges from day one in a very strong position. Day two is a general fight along the battle line for, in the hopes that Lee had that he would breach the Union lines and be able to win the battle. Day three, we all know Pickett's charge. And again, this is a frontal assault by Lee against the Union lines. And he felt his men could do it, but it's not gonna happen that way. And you'll notice here too, there's a slight advantage of the number of Union troops, all told about 94,000 versus the Confederates at 72. But don't forget, the Confederate armies had won battle after battle after battle. So 20, 30,000 less troops. We have the valor and we have the leadership. We'll beat those Yankees. Oh, thank you. Okay, what happens in retrospect on that first day is General John Buford of the Cavalry is on an advanced scouting mission. And now and you will, and because he was looking for the Confederates, he bumped into them. And what happens is that his troops would, to delay the march of the Confederate army, he had his troops begin skirmishing with them. So the typical cavalry way to do that was for one of the cavalry men would hold 4 horses, and the other 3, now that they were all dismounted, took their carbines and would go and fight against the Confederates. So Buford was able to hold the Confederate army at bay to an extent, because now both armies are becoming aware. Lee and Meade are becoming aware, oh, we've made contact. This is where it's going to happen. And so throughout the day one, the Confederate armies will mass north toward Gettysburg, as will the Union armies. And interestingly enough, remember John Reynolds? He was offered the generalship of the Army of the Potomac. He's killed by a sharpshooter. He's immediately replaced by another general. But it's just kind of ironic that this probably wouldn't have happened, because he would be far away from this initial contact. One of the reasons that the Confederates didn't do as well on this first day is that Stonewall Jackson was no longer with the army. He had been killed by his own men in a freak accident. And so Jackson, as you remember, had all this, he was always an aggressive leader. And he would have pushed where our friend here, Richard Ewell, wouldn't push. And so Ewell was asked by Lee, if practicable, rouse those Union troops off the nearby hills. And I think I have oh, I'm sorry. And had Jackson been there, I think the Battle of Gettysburg would have been very much different, because the Confederates would end the day with some high ground. That's what you always want if your army is going to have to fight a battle. Have high ground, make the opposing army come at you. And so Ewell did not press it. Lee also had, and I should point out, I did not paint these pictures. There's a guy named Mort Kunstler, and he was a historic painter who became mesmerized later in his career by the Civil War. And so he has painted over 300 pictures like this. And I think this is just remarkable, because here you see the Confederate flag, you see General Lee in the middle, and his old war horse, General Jim Longstreet, is with him. And this is how it would look. This is how people got around. There weren't tanks or squad cars or anything like that. Everything was horseback. So the key thing to know about Jim Longstreet is he disagreed with Lee's whole idea, his whole strategy. He felt, don't go after the Union, find places for us to have a defensive line and let the Union come after us. They've tried that before and lost, but Lee wanted to attack. Lee was a vicious attacking general. There's no question. And if he had had enough men and material, he would have probably beaten the Union by this time and forced things to happen otherwise. So that's day one. Day one, the armies collide. The Confederates muff their chance for the high ground. The Union emerges with good high ground to defend. And here you can see it, and you've probably heard of Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and so these are what will be the Union lines. And so on day two, it's Lee's attempt to dislodge the Union army wherever it can, but they didn't really find a weak spot. And if you look down here, you see this name Sickles? Let me go, I'm sorry. Sickles is out of place. That line here should go right down to Little Round Top. But it doesn't, because Dan Sickles, and we'll see his picture in a minute, is a political general. And although he was under orders, he said to himself, hey, I don't like the position I've been given by Meade. I think I should move up a little bit and find better ground. And because he did, there would be hell to pay for his troops at that time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I point this out again. This is Old Baldy. This is Meade's favorite mount. And I want to point out that warfare in this time was all on horse. So if you were on Meade's staff and Meade wanted to talk to some or send a message, he would get a courier from his staff. You jump on your horse and ride like blazes to go and deliver the message. Sometimes written, sometimes verbal, and sometimes it was, if it was verbal, because it was so important to hide, the escort may not say it just as Meade wanted it to be said. And so the corps commander might not understand the full import of the message. So a lot can go wrong. And Meade is going to spend day 2 going up and down the Union lines. It's about a 4-mile line from Gettysburg to Little Round Top. And he was just plugging in the holes. If the Confederates looked as though they were going to breach a position, he'd order another, some backup for it. So he was in overall charge. He always wanted to make sure that his commanders, his sub-commanders, knew where he was. So he was very intent on getting the information out there. And of course, this is Pennsylvania in July. It's 90 degrees, just like it is now. It's hot. So here are soldiers, many of them on both sides have marched a long way, 20, 30 miles to get here. And now they're facing battle with each other. So day 2 is a very busy time for Meade, but Lee is not able to bring his armies to best or breach the Union lines. Now here's Dan Sickles, just to pinpoint him a little bit. When I say political general, he's not a West Pointer. So yeah, he thinks he has some military experience, but he was not a military man. And in fact, after the day's battle, and this is where the peach orchard, it was really a slaughter of his group because it was so exposed. And by the time Meade found out that it was exposed, the Confederates were already advancing against his positions. And so he will lose a leg at the battle on that second day, and he will also be relieved of command. Meade didn't want to have anybody who wasn't true military leading the troops. The other part, and this is at the bottom of the Union line on Little Round Top. This is the southernmost position of the Union Army. And if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, which I really recommend you to see on Netflix, I think it is, you will see that Chamberlain is he's a colonel. This is a Maine regiment, the 20th Maine, and he will be told by his superior that you're the end of the line. If you let the Confederates turn us, in other words, they breach you, go around, then the whole rear of the Union line will be imperiled. So you must fight to the death. And so Chamberlain's group runs out of ammunition toward the end of the day, and he knows he's got to do something. So his order is fix bayonets, and they charge down the hill from Little Round Top. And the Confederates, who by this time had made 2 charges up the hill toward Little Round Top, were just taken aback that the Union would do this. And the battle was over. And the Union saved itself and preserved its line. So this is what happened on day 2. The Union stands fast, holds firm. That evening, after, now we're talking about 10 o'clock in the night, Meade's headquarters, which is a tiny little farmhouse just near the battle, Meade calls all of his corps commanders together to have a council of war. Remember, they've just worked together since, what, July 28th, 29th, 30th. And just a few days. So he doesn't lead the discussion. He's not like, I don't know, if General MacArthur or Bull Halsey, the admiral, they would have had a presentation and so forth. Meade just sits in the background and lets his commanders talk. And so they decide as a group, we hold good high ground. Let's maintain it. We shouldn't go on the offensive, and we're in a good spot. We're exhausted. Our provisions are 25 miles away. So they're still in disarray. Our soldiers are hungry, and we're low on ammunition, but we're in a good spot. So let's stay that way. At the same time, that evening of day 2, General Jeb Stuart, the cavalry commander for Lee's army, he's been away. He was told by Lee to go out and scout the territory. And what he did was he pounced upon a couple Union wagon trains filled with provisions. And so he's unaware that there's a battle unfolding at Gettysburg. So he comes back, he thinks he's going to be welcomed with open arms. General, I brought you all these provisions. And Lee, to the left there, says, but you left me blind. Lee wasn't able to send out Stuart's cavalry to really find out what the Union situation was. And so this was another blind spot that Lee had to countenance. So Stuart, who again, the Confederate cavalry has been unrelentingly successful. You'll remember the Peninsular Campaign, where George McClellan tries to get to Richmond using that position, and Stuart rode all around it, and the Union cavalry was unable. By this time, by the second year of the war, the Union cavalry is getting its act together and will, the next day, day 3, while Pickett's charge is going on, there's some cavalry skirmishes to the rear of the Union army, and they were not successful for the Confederates. So here we have, and again, don't be mesmerized by the individual things. This is Pickett's lines. You're going to have nearly 13,000 men march nearly a mile to the Union high ground and try to take it. And Lee, remember, Lee thinks his men can do it. We've always bested them before. So George Pickett has not been part of the battle yet. So his troops are fresh. And he's intent on glory. And he gives the, it's a magnificent scene. in the movie, because all these troops now are walking forward. Their battle flags are being held, and they're being led by the various generals. For instance, here's Richard Garnett. Now, Garnett was too sick to walk, so he had to ride a horse if he was going to lead his men. The other thing was Stonewall Jackson was his commander early on. And at one point, Garnett's troops were surrounded on three sides, and without an order from Stonewall, he retreated. And Stonewall Jackson had him arrested because he failed to obey orders. And there was an actual court-martial, but the court-martial was interrupted by the need to fight battles in the Civil War. And so Garnett was really never cleared of this shadow on his career. And he felt that he had to participate in this charge to redeem his honor. They never found his body. He would be blown away because of what's going to ensue. Here's an idea of the Confederate soldiers marching toward the Union lines. And again, 3/4 of a mile doesn't sound like much, but there were a couple fences in the meantime. And at some point, the Union Army, there were parts of the Union Army that were able to fire on them on their flank, on their side. So they're marching up this hill and they're being bombarded by the Union line. Here's General Lewis Armistead, and he leads his men over and breaches the Union line for just a moment, because there are not enough of them. By then, his group had been decimated, and all the Yankees, they killed everybody. He is killed then. And Armistead was a very good friend of General Hancock, and they had served together. Most of these guys had served together on the plains, or they were engineers together. They all knew each other very well. So Hancock was rallying his troops on horseback, riding up and down the lines, telling his soldiers, and he was shot in the hip. And so as Armistead dies, he says, "Give my regards to General Hancock. I hope he is well." And so it just shows you how personal this was with many of the generals on both sides. And of course, at the end, I think this is a very poignant painting by Kunstler. You have Lee head bowed as the remnants of Pickett's charge walk back to his line. And because he thought they could make it. And you'll see in the movie, he says, "It's all my fault. I'm so sorry. Please gather yourselves and we'll fight again." Now, the losses to the Confederates, this is total, were 28,000 and 23,000 for the Union. But there's such a difference here in manpower. The South had, at that time, a population of, 5 million or so. The North, 50 million, something like that. In other words, the Confederates were running out of soldiers. They just didn't have the manpower that they needed. Whereas the Union would outproduce them in ammunition, in clothing, in provision. They just didn't have a chance. Now, here we have Kent Brown again. He had already written a book called Retreat from Gettysburg. It's about that thick. It's so detailed, it will mesmerize you. But he certainly knew a lot about it. And so we have a situation here where Lincoln now in Washington is saying, "Hey, we've stopped Robert E. Lee finally, and he's retreating. This is our chance to end the war. However, the Union was exhausted. Remember, their troops had rushed to Gettysburg to get themselves in place to fight the battle. Their provisions were 25 miles away. And wouldn't it rain right after the third day, July 3rd? So Gettysburg would be a quagmire to get around in anyway. And because of that, Meade is very cautious about what he's going to do. And so you'll see here, here's Gettysburg, and basically Lee is going to have to go down here, cross the Potomac River, and get back into Virginia to follow their day. This is about a 40-mile retreat, and it will be overseen by John Embolden. Now, he had not engaged his cavalry in the Gettysburg battle at this point, and he was one of the few members, according to Brown, that few members of staff that Lee would call by his first name, and so they were good friends. He was not a West Pointer, but he would conduct a masterful retreat as the Confederate Army marched south. And you can hardly see this, but the picture in the book is not much better. But if you can look down here, doesn't that look like a bunch of wagons? And that's what it is. They're the wagons filled with the provisions that they've looted and stolen from the North, plus their wounded, plus their ammunition, marching south, crossing a pontoon bridge here on the Potomac River, because that rain at the end of the day, on day 3, persisted for the next couple of weeks. And so the Potomac was at flood stage, and although it had over time did go down a bit, they had to cross a pontoon bridge to get over into Virginia and save the day. And one thing that I hadn't thought, and again, this is a Brown picture at the end of his book on the retreat, Confederate officers would bring their slaves with them. And Brown recounts several situations where the master, the owner, would have died or was very ill, and the slave made it his business to bring his master back home. He had an opportunity to leave service, if you will, to escape and become a free man, but he went back south. And I thought that was sort of interesting. And of course, just toward the end, they were so desperate in the South for manpower, they began arming the slaves to fight on their side. Just amazing. So we're heading toward the end now of the presentation. I just want to emphasize here some things, if you'll read down with me. Both armies were exhausted by these 3 days. Remember, this was not a planned attack. It happened out of the blue, and they made the best of the situation. So most of them hadn't been fed and were poorly clothed and were short of ammunition. And the weather was bad. I've talked about some of this. During that retreat, there were some incursions by Union cavalry into the retreating Confederate lines, but not enough to make any real difference. And so that's why Lincoln was so enraged at Meade for not following up. You got them on the run. You got to kill them. You got to annihilate them. And so Lincoln would never forgive Meade for what he perceived as a bad move on his part. Lee, on the other hand, did execute a very skillful retreat, skillful enough that the Union Army under Meade was not prepared. None of the corps commanders felt that they could pursue Lee. Our men are not able. They're just exhausted. They did have provisions at hand, so they were not starving to the same extent that maybe some of the Union were. And of course, Lee had this faith in his troops because they had done so well up until this point. So why did Meade ultimately win at Gettysburg? Even though he was surprised at his appointment, he took immediate command of the Army of the Potomac. And since he was a respected soldier already throughout the Union Army, his corps commanders would follow him. He enjoyed good intelligence. He conferred with his corps commanders. He was willing to discuss things. Lee, on the other hand, was essentially making all the decisions. Up until this time, he was foolproof. Why wouldn't he? The Union soldiers experienced their first success, and that was important to them. And so Meade won the battle, but he sort of lost his own notoriety for the rest of the war because Lincoln would never forgive him for not concluding it then and there. Lee never had good intelligence at Gettysburg. Remember, Stuart doesn't come in, his cavalry leader doesn't come in until the second day, the end of the second day, almost useless. Lee's command style was pretty offhand. He would generally say, like to Ewell that we've talked about, who was rather, he didn't pursue his opportunity well enough. He was not told, Stonewall Jackson would have told you exactly what to do. You will take that hill at the end of the day. And so there was no worry about it. Lee was not so straightforward, but he expected you to do it. So it didn't happen. And these corps commanders were new because they had just been promoted to their posts because Lee had reorganized his army at that point. So, and you'll see in the movie as well, Longstreet always hesitated to order his troops into action because he fundamentally disagreed with Lee's whole strategy. And so things could have been much better had Longstreet been there, but that was a blessing to the Union. And if you go to Netflix, that's the picture of the movie at Gettysburg. And I just think it's interesting that rather than having Lee and Meade, they have Chamberlain and Longstreet. Excuse me. That's what happens when you blunder. There we go. Both are much more, I don't know, photogenic. There's a story, you'll find out the story of Chamberlain. You'll see the reluctance of Jim Longstreet. So that ends my presentation. I think Gettysburg is just a remarkable battle. It could have gone either way. And because Meade was able to patch together a command structure and then follow through by being a hands-on commander, he was able to do so. And the unintended consequence, surely, of this was that now Great Britain and France, who might have come on the side of the Confederacy, because the Confederacy had cotton, and the Confederates thought, King Cotton, if we don't ship them, they'll beg to come over and help us because they need it. Well, they found other markets. And now that they see that Lee, their most brilliant general, has been bested, they're not as keen on entering and would not enter the war on the side of the Confederacy. So thank you for your attention, and we'll talk about it further if you have questions.
So is this on? Yes?
And the
So-
Q&A.
Bob, will you be my assistant? All right, so for the Q&A, what we will do, Bob Lewis and I will take care of the Q&A in this room. And Matt, you're going to handle it for Zoom. So we'll take one question in the room, one question from Zoom, and we will alternate that way. All right? You're the first question, ma'am. Marion, go ahead. Let me hand you the mic. This is kind of a mundane question, but you mentioned the heat in Pennsylvania, and I wondered what the uniforms were made of.
Wool. They were not in summer uniform. Yeah. Well, it's the same thing with the German armies going to Moscow in World War II. Okay, they had their summer uniforms on. And, you know, we'll be back by Christmas. So, yeah.
There's a question from Zoom. What was the next battle that Lee was involved in after Gettysburg?
Oh, good. Someone, this, is it the Wilderness? Okay. I'm not a gigantic student of the Civil War, so I don't really.
Bill Kennedy seems to know about the wilderness, so I'm going to ask him to say some more.
Good.
Well, no, I just want to make a comment. Lee's original strategy, that was to bring the war to the north. But he wanted to be in a defensive position and entice the Union Army to attack him. But things got out of hand.
Yes.
Another question here in the room, please. Behind me. All right, Jim.
Were the Union forces able to bring cannon to bear from the hilltop also against the...
On Pickett's charge, for instance, yes, indeed. The cannons were firing right into the advancing, like from me to you, that close. And, you know, they were firing things like grape shot, which have little mini balls, and they were just tearing the Confederate lines in part. So, yeah. Now, prior to that, prior to the actual charge, there was a bombardment by the artillery of the Confederates for about 2 hours, about 270 cannon. And they thought that they had softened up the Union lines. And indeed, yeah, they had caused some casualties and so forth, but they really hadn't done much. And so Pickett's armies, when they marched, were marching right into the fully manned Union lines with their artillery.
Rich, Rob, would you give Rich the mic?
Thank you. Since the Confederacy, left the battlefield fairly quickly thereafter, and they had 28,000 casualties or bodies. Was it up to basically the Union Army and local residents to actually bury the Confederate soldiers?
Actually, so yes, they were unable because Lee, after Pickett's charge, expected Meade to commence some sort of an operation against him. Meade, of course, wouldn't, but Lee had to be prepared. So those Confederate soldiers who were on the ground and from the other battles just lay there, and Lee moved on. Yeah, so the people of Gettysburg ended up helping the Union soldiers bury the dead.
An excellent book that the former president of Harvard wrote about the medical practices
Wait,
during the
just a
Civil War,
second.
and it's pretty gruesome.
Rich, You want to take the mic back? Everybody wants to hear you.
Yes, former president of Harvard, Dr. Faust, wrote a book on medical practices in the Civil War, and not just dealing with Gettysburg, but the whole panoply of the Civil War. It's pretty gruesome reading, and it's just the suffering that the soldiers went through, from the wounds that they suffered and eventually died from. But it's a remarkable book that I recommended. I forget the title of it. I read it about 10 years ago. But it's just kind of frightening just to view that.
Right. I think, I've read a book by her, and I think it always talked about having a good death. And the idea being, ideally, you'd be wounded and go home and die. And because if you didn't, you might die in a hospital after your amputation. Sir.
The Union had roughly 20 sanitary commissions from the various 15 to 20 states of the North, and they provided the succor for the troops on the ground and gathered them up and saved the lives, where the Confederates died on the ground, the sanitary commissions, civilians, 100% civilians, came and picked these guys up and not brought them back to life, but if there was any life left in them, they survived.
Mhm. Yeah.
A lot of historians in the audience. We very much appreciate all of these additions. Okay, just a comment. Not very many people know that Paul Revere's grandson or great grandson lost his life. Actually, he died of his wounds that he received at Gettysburg. And William Dawes, who was the second writer, his great grandson, Rufus Dawes, led the Wisconsin regiment, and he was one of 80 from that regiment who survived. And his great grandson became vice president of the United States. But we never hear anything about William Dawes because he didn't make it to Longfellow's home.
Excellent.
Thank you. No more from Zoom? Okay. Yes. Right here. Hang on, please. And put the mic right up to your lips if you will.
Did either army have repeating rifles at that time? Did the cavalry have?
Yes. Buford's Union Cavalry were using carbines at that point.
Where they have they reload a round by a lever, I believe. I'm not sure, but anyway, you gave me my answer. Thank you.
Okay. Not everybody had them at that
No,
point. Yeah.
Sure.
And of course, the Gatling gun is introduced during the Civil War. So, and we'll still have frontal assaults in World War I.
Sure.
Well, in Korea, the Chinese were not afraid to sacrifice soldiers. Okay.
Any more? More questions?
But I would encourage you to see the movie because it kind of brings things together. And, it's Hollywood, yes, but it's very interesting. And it shows you, for instance, so many of the part of Pickett's charge, they were all from Virginia. And, they marched to states. And it would have been a magnificent thing to see if you had been there, not if you had participated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yay.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Gresh, as usual, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you to our audience for adding all the local color and the details. That concludes today's